And we try to be pragmatic. Generally, we'll try to start small, see what we can get consensus on. We don't like to take work through the standards process unless we have some reason to believe it's going to be adopted. It's just a very slow process, and it's costly in terms of everyone's time. So we like to use sort of short projects to get some level of certainty, and then bring those through the formal process. Data right back into EHRs, particularly around observations and vital signs, has been a clear area of ONC interest for many years. They've convened stakeholder meetings and kind of solicited expert feedback on what are the right initial targets for data right back. They haven't put it in regulations yet, but I would not be surprised to see language like that landing in the upcoming HTI-2 rule. I wouldn't make a strong bet on it, but there certainly have been hints in the direction that might be coming. And that's always the most powerful way to focus these industry efforts, is to say, hey, we've got a regulation coming. We know we're going to have to do this. Now let's get aligned on how.
Yeah. So the output of that work, would it be this Confluence page that I just put in the chat?
So that page that you put in the chat is the right entry point for understanding the project. It's got the notes from all the calls that we ran over the last year. And then at the top of that page, you'll see something called draft specification. And so this is, for me, a broken link right now.
Yeah, me too.
Why that's a broken link. But this is an example where, based on the project last year, we put together some language that we thought would make sense in the national US core specification, not as a strict requirement, but at least as a set of capabilities that were documented in US core. So let me see if I can find you the corrected link for that by going back to the table of contents here. I'll ask Eric Haas, the editor. I see it. So I'll fix the link on that wiki page as well, but this is the direct link to the FHIR page. And so you can see this is an intermediate artifact that we put together. We landed it in FHIR US core, which is to say this is the guide that all the EHRs have to implement, but it's not a requirement. It's what we call a future of US core page. So we're laying out the scope of where we're going to go and how it should work. And this becomes something ONC can read and be inspired by and say, like, yeah, we want more of that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that context. And we have started to see, just like in the past month, we have, well, I guess at HIMSS, our head of technology went and was specifically talking to Epic and Cerner about this. And NextGen, we actually do some API-based vitals right back in NextGen. But we were interested to see that Epic, I think, had published supported observations all of a sudden in specific link codes. So it is not helpful for CGM, because I don't even know that there are link codes created for like the time and range data yet. But it was helpful to see progress on that front in general. So again, appreciate the context. And then I'm happy to switch over into like the CGM conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think there's going to be a lot of common themes between writing vitals back and writing CGM data into the EHR, with the difference that you pointed out already, which is vitals are a super well understood data type. CGM still well understood, but less so and less commonly used. So that creates some additional modeling challenges or decisions about what granularity of information to bring in. So maybe just to get started, can I ask you to describe today what are the places where Rimidi uses CGM data all up, and then what are the places where that data or a summary or report of those data would show up in front of a clinician, and where would they actually land in the EHR, or do they land in the EHR today?
So we have integrations, API interfaces with both Dexcom and Libre, and soon to be with one of the other emerging CGM companies. And it looks a little bit different by vendor, right? Because they're not standardized. Those are proprietary APIs, but the commonality is the reports endpoint, right? Because that's really a diabetes guideline driven, report, right? An ambulatory glucose profile, or AGP. So every CGM manufacturer generates an AGP report. And that's what people are used to seeing in those manufacturers' portals, is their branded version of the AGP report. That's going to have time and range data, days sensor worn, sort of a visual summary, and then those key data elements on it. And I'm happy to pull up visuals of any of this if that's helpful.
Yeah, that actually would be super helpful if you've got examples handy, or if you can share afterwards.
Yeah, I can pull it up.
Awesome.
And so that's one common endpoint. A second is what people will refer to as glucose metrics, which are really, so an AGP report, the other thing defined by the practice guidelines is that it is a 2-week report of data. And so then the summary statistics in that, right, are 2-week averages of the percent time that a patient's spending in range. So we get that discrete data as well. Those, average for the last 2 weeks. Let me just pull one up because this will be easier to talk about while we're looking at it.
I recently got a Libre 3 just to sort of play with the data set more, but I didn't actually sync to the Libre backend. Maybe I should. It sounds like they generate one of these.
Yeah, they'll generate the report and you can see it.
I'll make sure my data gets uploaded there so I can see it there too.
Yeah. So, okay. Let me go back, find my tab where this meeting is happening. Okay. So we're, have an integration with them. These are all patient grant, right? So the patient has to authorize data sharing through either a text or email link they get. They go through an OAuth process.
Wait, can we actually pause there for a sec, or at least I want to come back to that process. Maybe we'll put a pin in it because that sort of onboarding, I understand, is a common challenge. But yeah, let's dig into the report to start.
Yeah, so here's the report. This is actually one that I wore, and I don't have diabetes, so my data is almost all in range. It's kind of a boring looking report. But
in range, less than 180. Okay.
Yeah. So and again, this is like standards. These glucose ranges here in the gray box on the left.
Yep.
Those are as defined by guidelines, right?
Yep.
So
this is not Abbott making decisions about how to summarize.
It's not Abbott, and it's not the patient setting their own range, which you'll see in Libre 3 you can do on your app, and the provider can update that. But like these are the standard guideline-based ranges. And so, they're visually summarizing it here. Everybody has a very similar visual.
Yep.
You would usually see, let me see if mine had any older data that actually had it better. Yeah. Anyway, we could pull up a different patient, but it's generally, you get the picture. Usually it would have a graph here of the data as well.
And they give you basically one of these for each 2-week sensor that you wore. Exactly.
And then this is the discrete data that they also make available through their API. So this, time in range, which is this target range. And it's confusing because people will generally refer to this as time in range data.
Yeah.
Some people specifically mean time in target range when they say time in range. Mm-hmm. And then you have time in very low, time in low, time in high, time in very high. Those are all reported as 2-week averages. And then you get, average glucose, GMI, which is this glucose management indicator, glucose variability, and usually days, sensor worn, et cetera. So if I go back over here, this is our interface, right? So this patient, me, has authorized data sharing to Rimidi. And so once a day, we are pulling in the latest report and the glucose metrics for that 2-week period. So I last wore my sensor on November 9th. That's why the data stops there. And we would be receiving all of this. These are all the time and range ones. And then, average glucose variability, days sensor worn, Abbott defines.
Check on that. So like when it says days sensor worn, let's imagine you were accessing this page while you were 8 days into a sensor.
Mhm.
You would get all these statistics for the previous 8 days. It wouldn't be the complete 2-week report, but like it would just keep growing until you finished with that sensor. Is that right?
Correct. And then it's a great nuanced detail. I'd have to ask my team, but I think, obviously the company's goal is that like you wear sensors back to back, right? For people who, and so I believe that day sensor worn would actually roll between 2 sensors, meaning if I had finished November 9th, put a new one on the 10th, I would show sensor worn, 14 out of 14 days if I didn't miss, if I didn't have a gap. Yeah. So we're getting all of these as discrete endpoints, and that's pretty common between the CGM platforms. Meaning what we get from Dexcom, what we get from Abbott, what we'll get from this new partner are all pretty much the same. And then the nuances are Abbott does not share discrete data or timestamp data, as they call it, meaning all of the readings.
Really?
Yeah. Generally their policy is like only for a clinical trial or research purpose.
That's wild. So I was going to ask about this. I mean, I understand the importance of standardized measures and reports, and having like common statistics across the vendor products seems super important and useful. Yeah. But also, like, there is a tremendous amount of information in like just how spiky those spikes are, and whether you see oscillating. Like, just from looking at my own data, it's really clear that there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the details.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they have these various reports. So this is a different one called Glucose Pattern Insights, right? Where I can see that overlay. But again, this is Abbott's analysis.
This is a PDF, essentially.
This is a PDF. Yeah. Yeah. So, and here's a better view that has the AGP with actual data. I could see individual days, right?
And so like if I decided to use the results of some Stanford study for characterizing patients, maybe healthy patients, based on their glucose spike patterns in CGM, like I just couldn't do that based on the APIs that are available from the vendors today.
Not from Abbott. Dexcom does, in their standard partner API, give access to timestamp data. So, actual reading and time. And so with them, we receive that data. We'll actually graph that data in addition to showing the standard report and the insights. So, and then this, in our case, is showing in our Smart on Fire app. So that's how people are experiencing this, right? Is that this would launch in this patient's chart, through a smart launch, right? And so I'd be in the chart, I'd be able to open up the screen. We do sort of this contextualization of, all of these are endpoints that we've read from the EHR via Fire endpoints, and created this diabetes problem-oriented view to help contextualize that data. So that's our approach, and that's what we do with all device data, right? Whether it's CGM or connected glucometer, connected blood pressure cuff, right? Is to help with that physician interpretation, and then to help drive our clinical decision support around it. But so that's like level 1, right, of the experiencing of CGM data, is we are making this available in the chart so that the provider is not having to go out to a third-party portal that doesn't have single sign-on and doesn't, have a data interface. So maybe if you want to come back to that patient authentication, one of the, I think, really important things here is patient matching, right? So this patient may be a pre-existing CGM user, or it might be a new start, first-time CGM user.
Yep.
And when they are, launched into Rimidi, and the provider's like, okay, I want you to connect your Libre. We match those patients by saying, we know who this patient is in, let's just choose Epic, right? Because I launched from Epic. We created this patient in Rimidi from Epic. So we know those two are the same. And then most of the CGMs define patient by email. And so that's why the patient would either get, or phone number. So the patient would get an invitation via email or phone number to link their Libre account to the Rimidi account or the Rimidi record. And so that's kind of our daisy chain of like Epic creates Rimidi, Rimidi sends the known account an invitation, and then they say, yes, that's me. And they opt in. And as you said, that is a point of friction because you're going to people. Yeah.
From the patient experience perspective there, like I just want to even rewind the clock a little bit. Like if you've got a patient who's never worn a CGM before, the doctor says, okay, you know, I think we could really benefit from getting a better look at what's going on with your blood sugar. I want to prescribe you this device. At that point, the clinician, you know, knows that they have an EHR integration with Rimidi. They know that there's 2 or maybe soon 3 different device vendors that are supported.
Yeah.
So like today, the clinician can say, "Great, I'm gonna prescribe you an Abbott device or a Dexcom device, you know, maybe based on their own preferences or based on price or some conversation with the patient. They could sort of have their pick. They would write the patient a prescription,
Right.
and the patient's just going to go and fill that prescription like normal. They're not going to get a device sent to them that's pre-bound to a certain account in this scenario. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, there are 2 scenarios. One is, so I'll open this up. We can talk about the connection, but one is some practices sort of have this established workflow where when I'm going to start a patient on a CGM for the first time, I'm going to do it right there in the office, right?
Yep.
They want off the shelf, put it on, have me download my Libre or Dexcom app, set it up. And then traditionally they would be like, okay, go ahead and, you know, link to our clinic. So they might do this whole thing right there. Say I'm putting a Dexcom on someone. Pull off a Dexcom, put it on, send the invite here. So they would just click here. And I'd say, I want to email this. It's going to pull their email from the EMR, or I want to send a text. It's going to pull their phone number from the EMR. I'm going to confirm that that's correct. And I'm going to hit send, and the patient's going to get that invite right then and go ahead and accept. So that's like ideal scenario.
In that scenario, just make sure I understand it. When the clinician hits send message here, is Rimidi sending the message or they're contacting the device vendor?
No, we're sending the message.
So Rimidi sends the patient a message that says like, hi, your doctor wants to connect to this new CGM. And the patient will click on a link and they'll use that to make a new account with Rimidi?
They don't have to make an account with Rimidi. It's it's, you know, a patient specific, you know, time bound, it's going to expire, you know, link. So they're going to click it. It's going to send them to the device vendor page at that point, right? Because the device vendor is going to own that OAuth2 process. So say it's Dexcom, I'm going to get an email from Rimidi saying your provider wants you to share your Dexcom data via Rimidi. Click the link. I'm going to hit the Dexcom authentication page to log in with my Dexcom credentials. And then I'll hit the page saying, do you authorize Dexcom to share the following data elements to Rimidi? I'll say yes. And then I'm like one and done, right? Because then we're going to get the authentication token and the refresh token, and then we'll manage, you know, that.
So in these scenarios, all of the vendors have some OAuth API that you can use. And they all sort of work well enough for your purposes. You mentioned the email addresses like that the device manufacturers use as keys for the connection. But if I'm understanding the scenario right, you need this email address that's typed into this form. You need it to reach the patient, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the email address that the patient has set up with Abbott or whatever. And you know, people and that's where like data's a mess in the EMR, right? Like the email that they may have put in the EMR may not be the email they actually have on their phone or that they use. And you know, all of that. This needs to reach the patient, but it doesn't need to
get to them. They click the link when they hit the vendor page, then they're put in the username password that they used when they set up that account.
So that's from my perspective actually like a pretty nice workflow in the sense that it's at least consistent. Especially if the patient is in the clinic and you know there's somebody who can walk them through the challenging steps there. We did hear on a call last week from the Redox team about integrations that they sometimes do where there were 2 stories. One was like I think it was the Abbott app will generate like a 16-digit code that the patient can then give to the provider to establish authorization. I'm guessing that's sort of equivalent to the OAuth flow, but just involves more manual hops. And
they, you know, they have done some automated matching, right, on multiple criteria to try to capture those patients who already have an account, right? Not a new start, but, and, you know, can they match whatever it is, first name, last name, date of birth, from the EMR to first name, last name, date of birth, in a system like Libre. And, you know, there's going to be a percentage automated match and not, you know, we have multiple devices, not just CGM, who we have this same workflow. And like anything, when it's an opt-in process, you're going to lose some people who the email goes to spam, right? The whatever, you know, the email address was wrong in the EMR. And so it's not perfect, but like you said, I like that it's consistent. And then maybe let me just add, because I know we've got till 45. Okay. I thought we were done in 4 minutes. I was worried we weren't going to get to the right back part. But like, so that is how the data is getting to us and how the clinician is experiencing that data in our Smart on Fire app. So then the question is, is that enough that data is visible in the patient chart? We're going to cycle that data every day, right? So we always have the most recent 2-week statistics and report, and then we'll have all of the historical reports in 2-week increments. The reasons to write CGM in my conversations and experience are really the same as the reasons to write blood pressure data, let's say, back to the EMR. And it's kind of twofold. Number one, it's when a clinician is documenting a treatment change or assessment, kind of for, you know, medical legal reasons, they want to have the data on which that assessment was based in the actual medical record, which people don't really, you know, think of Smart on Fire apps as the actual medical record, right? Because it's not in the database. And so we have a note, you know, like note templates, and we have always had note write back. So we have templates that would automatically pull in that data. They can write an assessment plan, and we'll, you know, post it to the CGM progress note or whatever they want in, you know, Epic or Cerner or any of the EMRs. So that's one way to achieve that, but it's not discrete data. And so, and again, that's going to be like an on-demand workflow, right? If like this patient, I saw him in clinic, or the nurse had a phone call with them, they're having an issue, and I came in and I looked at the data and I made an assessment. I decided to make an adjustment to their insulin, let's say, and I want to document that. So I'd like to be able to push the data on which I made that decision back into my EHR to then tie it to my note.
Quick question on that, just before we go on. In that scenario, the doctor wants that extra information in the note. They'll go to Rimidi. They'll like launch the Rimidi app to make this happen, and then they'll basically click like generate note or generate draft note or something from there.
Yeah, so they can just generate the note in Rimidi, and when they save it in Rimidi, we automatically post it, you know, to the EMR with the LOINC code and note title and everything that they've defined.
And that's an HL7 V2 interface.
That's a document reference interface.
A FHIR interface.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I was going to say that isn't, you know, discrete data that's available in a dot phrase or, you know, whatever. So that would be then, no, you know, that note's great, Lucie, Rimidi, thank you, but I actually want discrete data. Mm-hmm. I'll come back to that in a second. The second reason in general why people want to write home patient-generated health data into the EHR is for quality reporting. And while that's not a real thing today in CGM, meaning it's not an official quality measure and, you know, at least the big, you know, measures, HEDIS and other things, we have been down this path with blood pressure because it is, right? And they need to, and I'm 100% on board with that of like, if you were doing your quality reporting out of Epic, then the data on which you do that reporting should be in Epic, right? Like having it in Rimidi doesn't do you any good. And so that's why we have ended up, you know, doing data write back to date using, you know, HL7 web services into flow sheets so that blood pressure data is there to feed into their quality reporting. The same thing, everybody believes that I talk to, the same thing's going to happen with CGM, that time and range will become a quality measure. And therefore, right, we need to get it into the EMR. So then you've got kind of two reasons. One, because I want to do quality reporting, or I have to do quality reporting. And the other, because I am, you know, needed to be part of the permanent record because I made a medical decision based on it. Yep. So then the question is, how often do you write that data? I think it's, and I strongly counsel people against writing 2-week average data every day. I think that's very confusing for an end user to see in a flow sheet, because everyone wants to put everything in flow sheets, and I don't know that that's where this should go, but that's neither here nor there. But how do I look at something that's, it's like an index, right? It's like changing slightly day on day.
Yeah. But that's a thing. Let me try to phrase this. Before you just mentioned that idea of writing a 2-week average every day, that never would have occurred to me, because what a strange thing to do. But is that something that people do sometimes, or they think about it?
They ask for that because they don't know what else to ask for.
Okay.
They'll say, I need those glucose metrics in my EMR in a flow sheet.
Yep.
And then I respond, how often? Because like the 1st and 15th of the month, only on demand when you've made a medical decision about it. Because wouldn't it be weird to look at 2-week average date every day as an independent data point? And then they're like, oh yeah, that would be weird.
So great. This is so interesting. So what do you recommend, or what do people do?
I recommend one of those two scenarios of like, either, we agree, and I think 1st and 15th makes sense, that, we're storing that data point every day.
Yes.
And then we'll, basically run a job that writes it at those 2 time points. And then you have a complementary sort of like on-demand workflow of, I want to push a button and it writes back.
Because I'm seeing the patient on the 21st, and so I do want to record what I saw on the 21st.
Yeah.
That's going to the note, but I don't want to record every other day. I just want to cover the 2-week period.
Right.
Okay.
Because I think that's going to support, you're going to have some consistency here if you're going to use this for quality reporting. And, I think it's great that you all are focused on this, because there's a lot of angst around the trends in CGM, and it's going to explode as Medicare keeps expanding coverage and this moves into type 2 and broader use in primary care. Like, my experience in talking to clinicians about it is primary care doesn't have the bandwidth for sort of the level of granularity at which endocrinology has managed this. And primary care is a little bit more like, what's happening if I kind of squint my eyes and look at this from 30,000 feet? Whereas, endocrinology is digging into like that little spiky thing yesterday. And, and primary care does not have the knowledge or the bandwidth to do that. And so I think that model of like, you can get an idea of what's happening with this patient. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they having problems? With 2-week averages. And that is more than adequate, probably, and more than adequate to represent the overall health of the population. So then there's one more thing that we're very interested in, but I don't know if it's come up in your conversations, called glycemic risk index.
No.
So, and people will refer to it as GRI. So this is like a little bit of an academic exercise still. It hasn't made it into the practice guidelines yet, but people will say, first we managed diabetes with hemoglobin A1C, right? And it was like a 90-day average and didn't tell you anything about the spikes. Then we get CGM data, and people have focused on time and range, right? And now they're saying, but you know what? Time and range doesn't really tell you that patient who's 60% in range, well, what's happening the other 40%? And that matters a lot from a risk point of view. So GRI is like a weighted average. You can, if you Google it, you'll find, a website that shows you, and it's a weighted average of those different categories of high, very high, low, very low. And it gives, so we have built out a dashboard. Let me reshare my screen. So we're calculating time and range we're calculating GRI based on that time and range data. And, it's debatable, right? Of what's ultimately going to be that quality measure that gets written into different plans and things. So here's GRI, and it is categorized zone A to zone E. It's, a score of 0 to 100. Zone A is good, green. Zone E is bad, right? Much more hypoglycemia down here. So that's another interesting thing, right? And so then do we write GRI back? Because is it the even better indicator of that, of glycemic control in that patient? So what I want to be, you know, selfish as a health IT company, but what I want is, you know, support through an observation endpoint that we can write that they're, you know, are defined LOINC codes or some other coding system. I would think it would be LOINC for these different metrics, you know, the very high in range, low, very low, GRI, average glucose, all tagged, categorized as, you know, home data, not to be confused with a glucose reading taken in the clinic. And then it's just standard, right? Like that would be a joy, because today we're having to do all of these is HL7, nobody knows where to stick it, right? They're usually putting it in flow sheets. It's very heterogeneous what's happening at the health system side.
Yeah, I mean, this makes perfect sense. You mentioned LOINC codes. Do you know how well covered these concepts are in LOINC today, or for the ones that you think matter that don't appear in LOINC? Like, is somebody working on that?
Yeah, I've done other projects where we actually, like, the partner actually got LOINC codes, you know, issued that didn't exist. I was just looking at that when we first got on, and I do see, again, for time in range, that there's a code. I don't, I'd have to ask my team of, like, in the implementations we're doing, are people actually using this?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fair. Even for things that people aren't widely using, to say it's in LOINC, this code exists, that starts conversations much faster than like, hey, there's a bunch of different ideas about how to summarize glucose information, and some of them have LOINC codes and some of them don't, but it would be nice if we could write all of them.
Right.
So we'll definitely sort of compile a list of what concepts we've talked about today are in LOINC and what's missing, like what is that delta. I also want to see, like, maybe I will share a naive perspective and you can talk me out of it. I would have thought, you know, as the science evolves, there's going to be more and more ways to summarize a person's glucose history and what it means and the associated risks. There's no reason to think that, you know, next year we might not have better summarization algorithms. Maybe we'll start applying, you know, fancy machine learning data to the timestamp level data points and come up with predictive algorithms that have hard endpoints that people care about. Like,
yeah.
So like the sort of data curation person in me thinks like the best thing to do would be just to store the timestamp data. There's not actually that many of them. It's like, I think every 5 minutes for the current generation of sensors.
Yeah.
And like, if you store those, you can later recompute any metric you want from them. Why is that not the right way to focus a project like this? I can think of some reasons, but I'm curious what you'd say.
I mean, I think number one, it's not totally standard between the different companies, right? Of how they share that, if they share that, right? And this is been a pretty, you know, red line for Abbott, that they don't share it. They think that there's too much value in that data.
Yeah.
You know, we can go down that rabbit hole of like, whose data is it though? Is it the patient's data? But
Abbott does at least let you download a CSV file with those data. Like they expose it to the patient.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, maybe in the way that genomic data, right? Of like, we have much more data than we understand. And so the strategy is like, let's store it all for when we do better understand it, so we can go back and mine that. That approach makes sense to me logically. I think there's still this general like fear and anxiety from a malpractice and legal. I mean, I still, Josh, get all the time, I'm on calls with doctors who are like, don't put data in my EMR that I'm not going to review, because then I'm liable for it. And if something happens to that patient and their lawyer comes back and proves that the data was there and nobody looked at it, then I'm liable for that.
What do you tell them?
And I'm just like, that ship has sailed, people. Like, it's the paternalistic model of healthcare, right? Of like, before we would let patients view lab results before the physician had interpreted them and signed off, right? And like, thank God we've moved generally past that with open records. And I just think it's a culture problem, right? And I get it that it's a litigious society problem. But, what I say to them is, but you're prescribing the CGM to the patient anyway. And are you setting the expectation with that patient of like, I'm not going to look at any of your data, even though I can today in LibreView. I mean, that patient is linked, likely to the prescribing clinician in that web portal. Like, does that really make you feel better that you have the excuse of, oh, but I don't log in there until you come to the clinic, and so I'm not responsible for it? Like, is there really a difference in those two things? Like, the data exists in that cloud, and now it exists in your Epic cloud. How are those two things actually different? So
that's interesting. But in that scenario, ultimately, doesn't the health organization get to decide? Like they'll tell Rimidi, like, please submit data to us on a 2-week schedule or only on demand. Like they're still kind of in control of the policy, aren't they?
Well, they are. I mean, but the fact that it's kind of always available in our Smarter on Fire app, right? That gives people angst, But
Wow.
what if I don't launch the app and look at it? And
Okay.
Diabetes is a great example, though, because there's this long history of patient education and self-management, right? And when somebody starts on a medication, your big risk, right, is hypoglycemia. And when someone starts on insulin or another medication that can cause hypoglycemia, right, you teach that patient how to treat hypoglycemia. So that's often what I say is like, because their data is now connected, you're not changing your expectation that if they have a severe hypoglycemia, they're going to treat it. Right? Like, tell your patient that, like, don't expect your phone to ring and me to call you and say, hey, I see you're having a severe hypoglycemia, right? Like, so, if you kind of talk them off the ledge, I can generally get them there, but it's interesting that maybe 25% of the time, that is the knee-jerk reaction of like, if you put that data in my EMR, I'm then liable for it. Yeah.
Fascinating. I think you nailed it. This is a cultural issue, and it's a slow process to change.
Slow process to change. And so to your point about better indices, better metrics, I mean, if you look at GRI, this is not a new concept.
Sure.
The field is incredibly divided about it, right? Yeah, they publish studies, but is it actually useful clinically, right? I mean, that'll take like another 5 years for that decision to be, for consensus to build around that. And unfortunately, I don't think we're getting anywhere close to significantly speeding up that time frame of like, we find new techniques and they are kind of instantly adopted in practice.
Ooh, well, I really appreciate your making the time to talk through all of this and also letting us record it. This is super helpful. We'll share the information about this project that's launching later this month. We'd certainly love to have folks from Rimidi participate if it makes sense for you all. Yeah,
that'd be great. I have like 2 people who this is their focus, an engineer and an integration interoperability person. So yeah, I'll share that with them and see if either of them is interested in participating.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to hit stop on the recording. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Have a good weekend.